The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the IEA's embargoed webinar for the Africa Energy Outlook 2019. People are still just dialing into the webinar, so we're going to hold on another minute or two just to give everyone a chance to dial in, and then we will begin shortly. Thank you. Okay then, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're from and where you are right now, and welcome to our embargoed webinar for the Africa Energy Outlook 2019 report. Let me introduce myself first. I'm Jethro Mullen. I'm a senior and editor writer in the communications department of the IEA. And just to let you know that this webinar today is open to members of the press and experts. And we would like to remind all participants that the report and all the contents of the webinar are under embargo until 1 a.m. Paris time tomorrow, Friday, the 8th of November. Today's presenter is Laura Cozzi, the IEA's Chief Energy Modeler. After Laura's presentation, you can, or just towards the end, you can type in your questions in the WebEx box on your screen for the Q&A. If you have any further questions following on from the Q&A, you can follow up with us afterwards at press@iea.org. So with that in mind, I'll let Laura begin the presentation. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jethro, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. We are very thrilled to take you through the Africa Energy Outlook 2019. It's work that we have begun nearly a year ago with a huge amount of resources from the IEA, several dozens of colleagues, and over 100 reviewers externally. And this is a testament of the increasing IEA institutional engagement with the continent. Morocco and South Africa are now part of the IEA family member. We have signed a memorandum of understanding with the African Union Commission, and throughout this work, we were guided by Kande Yunkela, the former UN Secretary General representative on SC4All and the first CEO of SC4All. We have worked also very closely with a number of other ministries and institutions across Africa. We are very pleased to see that they joined us today. I would like to acknowledge also that some of our colleagues of this work that are joining me here today, Stephanie Bouquer, Kiran McNamara, and Kim Tayoun, will be traveling to Johannesburg upon invitation of the African Development Bank next week at the African Investment Forum to present this work. So if you happen to be there, please do let us know so that we'll make sure that you can join us in Johannesburg for the presentation. Let us start with the context. We are seeing increasing population and urbanization trends across Africa with desires of strong industrialization in many countries across Africa. And for this reason, Africa is becoming increasingly influential for global trends and energy trends as well. Last year alone, 2019, Africa accounted for 40% of the global growth in population. And this is going to grow over time. We are seeing advances in renewables and seeing advances in renewables and natural gas that are acting as an accelerator to development in a few countries. Unfortunately, in many others, we have seen energy remaining a brake to development. What does that mean? First of all, access to electricity. We have one good news, which is our data show that we've reached a peak in terms of people without access in 2013 at around 610 million people. But since then, really, the number hasn't declined very much at all. Another important point of consideration is the following. We started tracking as IEA number of people without access to electricity back in the year 2000. And back then, Africa was home to 30% of the global population without access to electricity. Today, in 2018, this share has risen to 70%. We often focus on electricity and we forget clean cooking, although I have to say, again, thanks to the great leadership of Dr. Yumkela, this is now becoming much more present in the global energy agenda, something that also our executive director, Dr. Birol, has pioneered for the past 20 years, clean cooking. In Africa, nearly a person out of 2 is still using primitive cooking methods that have consequences for a number of things. First, health of women and children. We estimate 500,000 people a year are dying prematurely for using primitive cooking methods. It has implications on gender because women are spending a lot of time to make sure that these fuels are collected. And it has implications on education, as children are usually the second carer for going and collecting this biomass. Second point is really about electricity. Electricity is not key only for access, it's key for any productive uses. Last year alone, 80% of industries in Africa experienced blackouts. This has really had a tremendous brake on economic growth in many, many countries around Africa. One of the key reasons is the low level of investment is actually the lowest level on a per capita basis. Africa is attracting 4% of global power investment while being home to nearly 20% of global population. And finally, it's an item that goes back to clean cooking, but not only. Biomass dominates largely the energy mix in Africa today. Biomass accounts for 45% of fuel use in Africa. If we go back into energy history, this is even before a century ago. When you look at global averages, the globe was using wood at these shares 100 years ago. So there is a big need of modernization of fuel uses and technologies. So some of you may remember that we have already looked at Africa 5 years ago. We felt it was time to come back and look at Africa again, as there have been some exciting news on decline cost of solar, on mini grids, and now those can be deployed throughout the continent, on digital finance that is allowing more reliability, in fact, in payments, and innovation for a lot of the young entrepreneurs that we had the pleasure to meet in several occasions that are bringing a new push towards a new wave in Africa energy development. We have analyzed for the first time 11 countries: Angola, Cote d'Ivoire, Congo, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Mozambique, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania. The colleagues that are joining me here today spend hours and hours collecting the data, making the analysis, and we'll be making all this available for everyone as of tomorrow on our website. Importantly, I think we have tried to capture the dreams and aspirations of the African continent in the Africa case, where we looked country by country how the heads of states have put together their pledges for Agenda 2063, and we have tried to understand what does the energy sector need to do to make sure that by 2063, we really do have, as Agenda 2063 motto says, the Africa we want. So let's try to start from the basics, population growth. Here is the population in 2018. If we move forward, we see that by 2023, actually, Africa becomes the most populous region in the world, overtaking China. And by 2040, Africa is home to over 2 billion people. Two important points to note here. Over the next 20 years, Africa will add 800 million people. This is huge. This is basically imagining Europe and US moving to Africa over the next 20 years. And the other important point to know is that the majority of these people, 600 million, will either be born or living in cities. This urbanization trend to this scale will be the first time in human history that will be seen. China, during their big spur of economic development from 1990 to 2010, saw 300 million people moving or being born in cities. This will put a pressure on a number of economic drivers, including energy needs, to make sure that these cities are built, that this young population has jobs, and there is a thriving Africa going forward. Africa by then will have an average age, by 2040, will have an average age of 25 years. The rest of the world will be 12 years older. This is a great opportunity for Africa, but can also have challenges attached to it. So, who are the key countries that will be leading this population growth? Is Nigeria. By 2040, Nigeria will be nearly as large as the United States. Ethiopia, DR Congo, also part of the top 10 most populous countries in the world. Egypt, Tanzania, all larger than 100 million people by then. What are the implications for energy? So today, this is the situation. An energy mix very much relying on biomass and really not much diversification on the rest, with renewables really being tiny despite a huge amount of resources. We have analyzed where we would go if we take into account current stated policies across the countries and the continent at large. And what do we see? We see two things. Clearly an expansion, which is obvious because there is a population growth that very much drives this growth. Very low per capita level of car ownership today, only 15 cars per 1,000 inhabitants, that bring up oil use, together with the fact that LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, is going to be used by many more people in cooking. Natural gas expands because of the new discoveries. We'll come back to this earlier, but basically what we find disappointingly is that these scenarios with status policies fails to deliver the Africa we want. Why? For two reasons. It doesn't deliver the needed economic growth that would support Africa over the next 20 years and leaves still many behind. In the sense that we will still have a large part of the African population without access to electricity and still relying on old methods of cooking. So from now on, this presentation will actually focus on where we should go, which is what we call the Africa case. As you can see here, an Africa case could deliver a quadrupling of the economy while only needing a 50% growth compared to today in terms of energy use. How do we get there? We will explain this in the next slide. You will see 5 themes across the presentation, and those are: how do we deliver access? How do we make sure that the energy efficiency becomes prevalent? What do we need to do with the power sector? How do we manage resources and climate resilience? Let's start with access. This is the situation as we see it today and going forward with stated policies. So as I said earlier, we have seen a peak in the number of people without access to electricity around 2013 at just over 600 million. The number has really remained stable over the past few years, and we are seeing a slight decline going forward. There are some good news in a few countries. This is not working very well, I apologize. Kenya, Ethiopia, Ghana, Senegal, and Rwanda are all expected to achieve SDG 7, so full access to electricity by 2030. These countries have managed to put in place very good policies, increasing electrification rate in a very short period of time, and it's really new. We were not expecting this a few years ago. It's really thanks to having nailed down the right policies that those countries will manage to reach full electrification. It's not yet universal, and we will see what would be needed to reach there in a second. The other pillar of energy access, clean cooking, that I mentioned earlier. We are seeing the number of people relying on old methods of cooking reaching 1 billion very soon, and basically remaining up there. Also here, there are a few countries that have actually done good. Some are the same, Kenya pushing for LPG, Tanzania, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire also making very, very significant progress, but still not enough to get full access by 2030. So we have analyzed for electricity. This was done in collaboration with the Swedish University, KTH, and the results are going to be published tomorrow on our website in terms of the maps. You will see country by country and region by region these results. So we are seeing so you're trying to fix the slide problem? Okay, great, thank you. So this is the result in aggregate for Africa as a whole. What would it take to get to access for all by 2030? It's a combination basically of three options. Not one solution fits all countries, because the population density is different, because the resource there is different, because the type of investments and policy planning that you're seeing in terms of transmission is different. So 40% of the cases we see as the cheapest option being grid extension and grid densification. Mini grids, 30%. This for us is a kind of a new kid on the block. We are seeing a number of companies being interested in this, and is really a very promising area where we see a utilization of different type of resources that could provide electricity to a number of people in rural areas and peri-urban areas. And of course, standalone systems, this is really thanks to the steep declines that you're seeing in cost, mostly of solar, that we are seen to be the cheapest solution in nearly a quarter of the cases. If we move to clean cooking, here the solution space is more diverse. Liquefied petroleum gas and improved cookstoves represent the two of them combined 70% of the cheapest option that we see in terms of achieving clean cooking for all by 2030. But depending on where you are, electricity, gas and biogas, ethanol, and other solutions could be the right one. We are also excited in seeing some innovation coming from African women, bringing in local resources to see how best utilized in villages could bring actually clean cooking solutions that sometimes sitting here are not immediately immediate or not the same one that we have utilized in developed countries. If we move to another area, which is really climate impact and efficiency, today in Africa, 700 million people need cooling. This is clearly related to climatic conditions, is related to where people live in urban areas. The important thing that we are finding is actually that for two pressures, one on the urbanization, so the increasing number of cities and mega cities, a lot of number of cities that will be above 20 million by 2040, and the changing climate that will extend the areas where very hot places will be covered with, the number of people needing cooling will increase tremendously and reach 1.2 billion people by 2040. This is not only important for just feeling good where you are. This has implications for many other things. It has implications for food security, because you need to rethink the way you store food. It has implications for health clinics. It has implications for vaccines. It has really a widespread impact on livability of certain areas. If you focus on the cooling aspect alone, today Africa has one of the lowest ownership of air conditioners in the world, 6 units per 100 people. The average in the world is 60. In the Africa case, we have analyzed an increasing number of people as they become richer could get access to cooling. For us here, the key message is the following. If Africa was to get the average cooling efficiency that we have today in the world, the pressure on the power system could be cut by half, while providing a better living standard for a large amount of people. Now, efficiency here is key, and efficiency is key not only for the power sector, but we see it across a number of areas. I go back to clean cooking. If you think switching from biomass stove to an LPG stove as a ratio of 5:1 when you cook the same meal. So 5:1 in terms of energy needs if you switch from biomass to LPG. This reduces the pressure on future energy needs and future energy resources. If you think about cars, today the average car sold in Africa has an efficiency that is 50% worse than what we are selling in Europe or in Japan or in other places in the planet. It's something that we were selling, models that we were selling 10, 15 years ago, making sure that the average technology that we are selling today is available as soon as possible for African citizens will be key to make sure that there is an increasing amount of energy services without a strain on energy supplies. We stay a bit longer on the power sector. The potential for growth in terms of demand is very, very large, and there are a combinations of reasons for that. First and foremost is productive uses. Electricity is needed for everything. And if you want to have an African thriving industries, this is one of the first areas where we need to make sure that electricity is there, it is there 24/7, and is there at affordable costs. Today, most African enterprises are paying electricity prices that are much higher than the ones that we see in the developed world. Why? Because most of them have to buy a diesel generator to make sure that they get electricity all the time. We have calculated that the electricity cost in these cases is much, much higher than competitors around the world are actually paying. And this is putting a strain to those companies to thrive. The business misconception that we think is important to raise here is that most of the growth in electricity demand, in fact, 80% is going to come from richer households in countries like Angola, Kenya, Ghana, and Cote d'Ivoire, where we are seeing middle income classes reaching level where you start buying a number of appliances, you can pay for those, and the combination of those richer households and productive uses make up for 80% of the incremental growth. 20% is households that will gain access throughout the period. These are very important implications for the way we design tariffs and make sure that the poorest get access to electricity and the others pay the right price. On the supply side, we are seeing gas, especially in those countries that have huge resources, we'll come back to that in a minute, playing an important role to provide reliable and cheap electricity supplies, especially for productive uses, but the large majority of the growth is going to be renewables. Currently, we are shocked to see that Africa has only 5 gigawatts of installed solar capacity in the world, being home to nearly 50% of the global solar potential. Today, Africa is home to less than 1% of global solar deployment. Just to give you a sense of comparison, 5 gigawatts is the overall installed capacity of the Netherlands today, which I have to say, I'm sure our Dutch colleagues will agree, is not the sunniest place in the world. Hydro, wind, other renewables, all of them have potential in different places in Africa. One word on hydro, because we are talking about climate resilience here, we have done an analysis understanding climate variability and the impact on hydro going forward. And here we have to underline that in some areas in Africa, we will see a lot of disruptions on hydro because of the change in climate, and hydro resources have to be exploited, but we recommend that this is done always keeping in mind power pools and connections between countries. How do we get there? We need money. So today, we are really failing to get the amount of money that we need in the power sector in Africa. We will need to multiply that by 4, and an important couple of important elements here. First, there is a lot of discussion about generation, but networks are incredibly important. So half of the amount of the money that is going to be needed in Africa is about networks. And here, networks is not only huge transmission lines, we are also talking about densification of the grid, and importantly and increasingly, mini grids. Who will need this amount of money is really everywhere. A number of countries will need to attract this amount of money. Is it feasible? Have we seen it in the past and in the future? The answer is a very clear yes. India has done it. We are talking about 2.5% of GDP that should go into the power sector. India has done it over the past 20 years. China has done it. So it's something that is absolutely doable. Where do we see as being the key critical point? First of all, if you look at what has happened in the past, $1 of public spending in the electricity sector in Africa has raised only $0.6 of private money. This has to change. It has to change very, very soon, and it has to change dramatically. To give you the comparison of what's happening in Southeast Asia, the same dollar of public money invested has leveraged $4 and above. And this is what we need to try to do. How do we do that? I mentioned earlier, tariff structure is going to be very important because there will be a large amount of people that will have ability to pay. A second key point I mentioned earlier is now digital finance is allowing, making sure that the actually money payment is done. We see that the interconnection between new tariff structure and using digital payment could really help with cash recovery. How much of all of this does it cost simply for SDG 7? Is 33 billion a year, including clean cooking. This is currently less than 2% of global energy investment. We turn now to natural gas. You have seen that as being a recurring trend theme throughout the presentation. First of all, Africa was, for the past 7 years, home to 41% of global gas discovery. This is a huge number that shows that the continent is very rich in gas and so far being not very much explored. The moment we see money coming for exploration, we find gas, and we find large amounts of gas. And we found gas where? In the north, in Egypt. We found it in the west, we found it in the east, and we found it in the south. Mozambique and Tanzania in the east, more recently Senegal and Mauritania in the west. Also South Africa offshore has found new discoveries. And we would expect this trend to continue going forward as money will flow. So already today, Africa is a major player in global markets, in exports. Exports of Africa are similar to those of Australia. Going forward, we see this increasing very much. One big turn of the type of investment and how those should be utilized going forward. Most of the investment so far has been for projects for exports, Going forward to realize the Africa case, we do think that a lot of the investment should be redirected to fuel domestic industries, to fuel cement that is going to be needed to build the cities for these 600 million people, gas for fertilizers that is going to be needed to feed a 2 billion continent, chemicals, plastics, and so on and so forth. The amount of money that goes into the gas sector today should be directed more and more towards domestic needs. This has its own challenges, but we are seeing the gas business hopefully becoming more modular, much more like LPG has been so far. This could be a way forward to make the domestic gas business for Africa more attractive. If we move on to hydrocarbon revenues in general, so the income from oil and gas, we see very clearly that what has happened in the past is that, of course, oil and gas net income has fluctuated following how the global markets were going and prices were going. And what has happened to government expenditures is that they were following very, very closely the income from gas and oil. What's happening going forward, especially for oil? There are two pressures that you are seeing in the global market, one on supply and one on demand. On supply, there is a big advent, there has been, and there will be even more going forward, of shale gas that is putting pressure from the US on producers around the globe. And we do think that Africa will also suffer from this pressure, partly, and also pressures on demand. Demand in many areas of the world, there are wishes to diversify away from oil, from passengers, from a number of end users, and this may put an additional consideration for governments that hold these resources, because the amount of revenues going forward has uncertainties. And given the huge need of government expenditures, there has to be a more strategic thinking going forward on making sure that those government expenditures are financed towards a diversified mix of sources that would result in a more stable flow of financing coming from the government. In addition to oil and gas, we are seeing Africa becoming increasingly important on minerals. Why are those important? They have, you see here, very exotic names. Manganese, cobalt, platinum, and tantalum are one of the few that we have decided to look here. What are they needed for? They're needed for batteries that we are increasingly using in electric vehicles, but also to balance the grids globally. They're used in electronics for grids everywhere. They are used in hydrogen. So very critical material for the global energy transition. And Africa holds the keys, the largest part of the keys for many of those. The other way around is also true, that Africa on average gets 20% of product exports from minerals. Some countries are dependent on those for shares as high as 80%. So Africa is really key for the global energy transition, and a responsible and sustainable development of those minerals will be vital not only for Africa's economic growth, but also to ensure the global energy transition are done in a proper way, making sure that the local populations are also treated in the right way, and the environmental implications in the countries where those countries are exploited is fair. Let's look at the last point of this presentation. We have talked about the impact that Africa is already suffering from climate change, variability of hydro, increasing heat that will have implications for cooling, but beyond, on food security and beyond, putting really a brake on Africa growth. Many people are often asking us, yes, but Africa is also contributing to CO2 emissions. Well, up to now, Africa has contributed to 2% of global energy-related CO2 emissions. Now, many people are asking us, okay, but then going forward, you have a global population of, African population of 2 billion. How much is it growing, this percentage? Only to 3%. And this is in the scenario in which Africa doesn't materialize all its future aspirations and goals. Now, to be very honest, we hear a lot of concerns among several countries that says, okay, but then if Africa wants to pursue all the economic growth as they wish, this will put really in challenge the global climate goals. So here is the analysis that we have done, and this is how much the Africa share in global CO2 emissions will grow. Actually, you don't see it in the yellow bar because the 3% actually stays 3%. And if you were to include not only the change in CO2 emissions, but you were to include also other gases, for example, CH4, what we find is actually that moving away from unsustainable biomass, which produces CH4, would cancel out that small red increase. So while Africa is not at all a major emitter and is not expected to become a major emitter, is suffering already from the consequences of climate change. To get there, what do we need? Let's go to the conclusions. So Africa is experiencing a very strong demographic pressure, a very strong urbanization pressure, and this could be really incredible assets for Africa to strive going forward, but we need to do a few right things. First, make sure that Africa develops its unique renewables and gas resources in a good way, and that they would be then channeled to industrialization, really to make the most of the aspirations of African leaders. Lack of electricity access is being addressed in many countries. We have seen, and we are very proud and happy to report back that many countries are getting it right, in Africa too. But this has to be more widespread, and we see a new amount of solutions emerging, and the good news is that are not too expensive. So when the African policymakers have put this on top of the agenda, this is delivering, and this type of right energy policy should just be more widespread around the continent. We would urge, and this is really throughout the continent, to tackle head-on the unreliability of electricity supplies, taking on the network issues, and making sure that maintenance is done in a proper way. This will give an incredible boost to productivity of industries straight on. So reliable power and investment, making sure that we have a different leverage going forward, get the right tariff structure in place, and make sure that you get the money from the people that can pay. The Africa case, we have plenty of country-by-country recommendations that I would really encourage you to look up tomorrow in our website. But the key message for us, it does not to be energy intensive. There are plenty of technologies out there, cars, air conditioners, industries. Just get the right policy measures in place to make sure that those technologies, that they don't need to be the cutting edge of today, just the average of what we're using today in our countries, is available in Africa as soon as possible. And finally, let's keep in mind that Africa has emitted so far 2% of global energy-related CO2 emissions, will not be on the front line going forward for increasing those emissions, but is already in the front line to fighting the impact of climate change and climate resilience, especially and including in the energy sector, will have to be taken into account very seriously. I leave you with the website and invite you to explore it as of tomorrow. We have made all the data available for you to use and possibly guide you going forward in your analysis. And I'm here with 10 colleagues and ready to respond to all of your questions if there are any. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Laura, for the presentation. So everyone who's participating in the webinar, please put forward your questions in the WebEx box on your screen. We've already got a few coming in. We're just going to allow a little bit of time so that people can put their questions in, and we will get back to you very quickly. Thank you. Okay, so the first question we have is from Silvia Francioso. I'm afraid I don't have the name of organizations in the screen here, but she has a question about cooling. Did you assess in any way what are the required needs? Is it more air conditioning or refrigeration units for food and vaccine preservation? One of the report team here, Stephanie Bouquet, is going to answer this question. Stephanie.
Yes, thanks for that question. So in the cooling assessments, I mean, we have included both the cooling needs within the building, so that could be met by air conditioners and fans, but also refrigeration within residential sectors, but also in services sector, like for medical needs. Of course, electricity demand could have been higher for the cooling needs because we have also included energy efficiency measures for buildings, like passive buildings, and that has also decreased the electricity need that is met by air conditioners and fans from the slide that we have seen.
Thank you, Stephanie. And the next question we have from, excuse me, one moment, Andres Hoff. Do you make a distinction between modern and traditional biomass use for cooking? I think Stephanie is going to answer this one as well.
So, once again, thanks for the question. Indeed, as Laura has shown on the slide on the clean cooking technologies and the split by technologies and fuels to meet cooking needs, we have distinguished the traditional use of biomass for cooking. So in tree stone fire, the use of fuel wood, of charcoal, of dung, of agricultural waste, from the modern use in either improved cook stoves or modern types of biomass like pellets, but also biogas in rural areas or ethanol in different countries.
Thank you, Stephanie. We also have quite a few questions regarding gas, including do you encourage countries to continue to explore for gas? I'm just scanning the other ones. There's quite a few you were talking about gas, but building a gas infrastructure will be slow and mirror business as usual. Why is this a solution for SDG 7? So to try and address some of the various gas questions, Tae-Yoon Kim, one of the report team, is going to address those points.
Thanks, Jethro. So far, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, the gas has been a very niche fuel to date, because there are many reasons. The building, connecting consumers and producers, and building long pipelines between consumers and producers has been very challenging, and small market sizes did not justify this kind of investment. But there are some signs that future might be different from the past. And as Laura mentioned, there are large major discoveries in every part of the continent, from the north, east, west, and south. And also, there are some emerging technologies that allow distributing gas more efficiently. Like there are some emerging small-scale LNG technologies under development, and some countries are experimenting bringing gas and by trucks, complementing the traditional pipeline-based approaches. And the global market environments are becoming more conducive for the gas consumers. And when you think about the role of natural gas in the Africa's energy mix, when we talk about whole energy consumption, there are certain sectors that can be easily electrified. And here, the renewables can play a leading role, and we agree that renewables can grow as much as possible. But there are sectors that are hard to be electrified, such as industry. And here, the choices is usually between the gas versus other more polluting fuels, such as oil. And a lot of industries are using oil or even coal to fuel their activities. So here we think gas can play a role as a relatively cleaner fuels to support economic activities in Africa. So overall, we think thanks to the major discoveries in recent years, Africa can emerge as a major player in both in demand, production export in the global market.
Great, thank you, Tayoun, for that answer. We also have a question about what the role should be in the financing. Sorry, let me restart this. What should be the role of non-African countries, international organizations, and universities in the economic development of Africa? This is a question from Ionis Papis, and he gives some examples of China becoming the largest single trading partner for sub-Saharan Africa, and also India and Brazil shares. So Laura is going to take this one.
So thank you very much. I think this is a very, very important question, actually. And I would like to stress three things, in fact, here. First of all, we haven't touched upon during the presentation, but is a theme that we have throughout the book, is really about capacity building. Capacity building is really a key important need. When you think about 800 million new people, most of them young, we need to make sure that they get access to the best education possible. So I would really encourage, especially if you think this comes from a university, do as much as possible to provide the best education possible to those young new generations of Africans. Second, there was this question raised about who is financing in Africa today. When you look at the power sector, in the previous analysis and studies that we did, we actually found out that 1 in 3 power plants in Africa over the past 5 years were actually financed by Chinese entities. What type of power plants were there? Is different types, but on average, we find that the standard and the environmental standards that are applied in these cases are not as high as we would see when the financiers is others. So there is certainly a need and an important role to play to make sure that the environmental impact and safety standards and beyond for all power plants in the future in Africa are at the best possible. And certainly here, international organizations have a very important role to play, as well as non-African countries. And third, I mentioned this earlier, we need investment, and I think we increasingly need private money. So I think we all have a role to go and talk to industries and make sure that they understand that the situation in Africa is changing, that not all the countries are the same, and that an increasing amount of countries are becoming investable and investable with profits.
Okay, thank you very much, Laura. I'm afraid this following question is going to be the last one, as we're running out of time. So we've had quite a few questions about electricity access and electrification. What are the factors that that indicate a country will reach full electrification, and how can countries reach full electrification if tariffs are below cost, particularly with reference to Ghana and Ethiopia? I think Kieran McNamara, a member of the report team, is going to take this question. Kieran.
Thank you for your question. There was also a question on the numbers of people without access at the moment, so it's just below 600. That's our latest estimate. On the factors that can indicate a country will reach full electrification, one thing, a clear strategy and program for electrification from governments supported by institutions and a suitable investment framework. And secondly, target 2 separate strategies, one on people living close to the grid and electrification via the grid, and secondary to that, populations living far from the grid and isolated communities via standalone systems or mini grids or solar PV-based systems. If tariffs are below cost, it would be very, very difficult for investors, for networks, for state utilities to recover the cost they've invested. And we see that a large share of African utilities are operating without making profits at the moment. They're earning a low return on their investments. Therefore, it is very, very difficult to reach full electrification if tariffs are below cost. But it's important to remember that most of those electrified at the moment are the middle class and the who can afford to pay full cost tariffs without subsidizing industry or other categories. Therefore, there has to be different tariffing strategies for
newly electrified customers and for those connected to the system via the grid already. And also there's a case to take advantage of new microfinancing tools and making customers to be able to recover and pay their tariffs under different tools such as mobile banking technologies, incremental payments over weeks, over days, and that the tariff payments can match their incomes.
Great, thank you very much, Kieran. Thank you, Laura, for the presentation. Thank you to the rest of the team. And thank you everyone on the line for your questions and participation in this webinar. Just a reminder for all participants that the report and everything, all the contents of this webinar are under embargo until 1 a.m. Paris time tomorrow, Friday, 8th November. And a plug, the Africa Energy Outlook is part of our forthcoming World Energy Outlook report, which we will launch next Wednesday on November the 13th. And for this, we'll be hosting a press conference at our headquarters in Paris for the launch of the World Energy Outlook 2019 next Wednesday on the 13th of November. Thank you again for your participation. Look forward to reading your stories for the journalists among you.